We're going to start our journey through Section A by looking at different measures of income. And we're going to look here at operating income, net income, earnings before interest and taxes, and earnings before taxes. And this is just so we have a sense of what these mean. We're going to kind of refer to them in different places in different ways. And so we just want to have a good understanding of how it is that income is calculated and kind of the different lines that can be created or the different categories, measures of income that can be created. So we start by looking at operating income and net income. And so we're just going to kind of build through the income statement and get to net income. So we start with our sales, our revenue, we subtract cost of goods sold, and that gives us gross profit. Okay? Sales, revenue, minus cost of goods sold is our gross profit. We then subtract out selling, general, and administrative expenses, and that gives us operating income. And that's our income from operations. Okay, how it is that we operated our business. From operating income, we've got a few other items. We're going to add interest and dividend income. Okay? We're going to subtract interest expense, and then we're going to add or subtract any non-operating gains or losses. And so the interest and dividend income and the non-operating gains and losses are not part of operating income, but we'll see they are part of earnings before interest and taxes. Okay, but we'll get to that. We'll see if this breaks out. So right now we have our income from continuing operations before income tax. We then subtract income taxes, and that gives us our income from continuing operations. Now what this means is if we're looking to buy this company or invest in this company, this is the amount of income that we could expect to continue to happen in the future, because this is the income from the operations that we expect are going to continue. And there's the name, income from continuing operations. We then add or subtract, if there are any, gains or losses on discontinued operations. There may not be any. Okay? For a lot of companies in a lot of years, there aren't any discontinued operations. But if there are, we have a distinction then between income from continuing operations and net income. And these gains or losses on discontinued operations, again, these are not part of operating income, but they are included in the calculation for earnings before interest and taxes. If there are no discontinued operations, then income from continuing operations and net income will be the same because it's plus or minus zero. So gross profit, operating income, income from continuing operations, and then net income. Okay, those are kind of the four main categories of our income statement where we come up with net income. But we also need to look at how it is that we calculate earnings before interest and taxes. This is different than net income. So we start with operating income, and it's plus that interest and dividend income, not our interest paid, but our interest and dividend income. We then have the adjustments for non-operating gains and losses, plus or minus, again, the gains or losses from discontinued operations, okay, not net of applicable taxes. On the income statement, they are net of taxes. And this gives us earnings before interest and taxes. Okay? So earnings before we pay interest and our earnings before we pay taxes, which is why that gains and losses from discontinued operations doesn't have the tax effect in it. Operating income, interest, dividend income, non-operating gains and losses from discontinued operations, that gives us our earnings before interest and taxes. Now, operating income does not equal earnings before interest and taxes. Well, it might. They're equal only if the company has no interest and dividend income, no non-operating gains and losses, and no discontinued operations. So if the company didn't have any interest or dividend income, no non-operating gains or losses, and no discontinued operations, then operating income will be equal to earnings before interest and taxes. But if they had any of these, operating income and earnings before interest and taxes are going to be different. So what is earnings before taxes? Well, the name is descriptive. As I said in the intro, we've got a lot of descriptive terms here. So again, operating income, we get all the way down to earnings before interest and taxes. We subtract interest expense, and that's our earnings before taxes. Okay, so the difference between earnings before interest and taxes and earnings before taxes is interest. But what you need to take away from this is how it is that we calculate net income, the fact that operating income is not necessarily the same as earnings before interest and taxes. It might be, but it's not calculated the same way. They're the same only if the company doesn't have interest and dividend income, non-operating gains and losses, or discontinued operations. Operating income, earnings before interest and taxes, and then the difference between earnings before interest and taxes and earnings before taxes is clearly interest. Okay, the name tells us that. But these are just different ways that we can measure income, and we need to understand what's included in them, and in some cases what's not included in them, so that when we see later something uses earnings before interest and taxes, something uses operating income, we understand how it is that we're calculating that number that we're using. Okay? Not difficult here, but just we need to make certain that we have this right in order, in the right order in our mind, so that we're using these terms properly going forward.